YouTube. And I think once I'm live on YouTube, then you guys will be able to see, if you're watching YouTube, you should be able to see me. And then once we're live on YouTube, we're going to start this conversation about Malcolm X. Hold on, I think. Okay, I see myself. All right, I see myself on YouTube. So we are definitely streaming. But what I want to do, okay, so hi YouTube, how y'all doing? If y'all can hear me, if y'all can see me. We didn't announce this because I wasn't sure if it was going to work, but you should be able to see me. We're going to have a conversation. I want to have a mini conversation today. It is Malcolm X's, Hajj Malik Shabazz's birthday, and I wanted to have a bit of a conversation about that and about what some of the things that Malcolm X was trying to explain to us meant, and what they meant, not just in that era, but what they mean now. And I really would like for this to be a bit of a conversation. So we're doing this via Zoom through YouTube. But what that also means is that I'm going to play some clips, and I think that if we do this correctly, YouTube, you all will be able to see the video of the audio that we are listening to. Amina has assured me we have no idea if this is going to work. So and I have assured her I have no idea what I'm doing, but we are both at the remote studios today, so we're trying to figure it out and make it happen. But we all may be familiar with the speech that Hajj Malik Shabazz, Malcolm X, gave, called the ballot or the bullet. And again, Malcolm X would have been 100 years old today. And I waffle between calling him Hajj Malik Shabazz, which is how he was known at the time. That was the name he took for himself. And the fact that we all know him as Malcolm X, because I want to be respectful to the ancestor, but I also know that not all of us know that his name is Hajj Malik Shabazz. I know some of y'all like, who don't know his name is Hajj Malik Shabazz? People, like young people, a lot of people. We literally have an entire population of people who are learning about Malcolm X for the first time. Mainly because like we're celebrating his I was going to say his anniversary, his birth, his ancestral birthday. But I want us to have a little bit of grace for the people who don't necessarily know what Malcolm X was or who he was, but I also want to make sure that we're able to do so in a way that makes the conversation that he was having in the 60s relevant for where we're at today. And everything Malcolm X said is very, very relevant. So I want you all to listen to this clip. This is taken from the speech, The Ballot or the Bullet. And I think if I did this correctly, Amina, you have the clip. We're going to play it from 0 until 135. And then I want to pause with what he's saying there, because he's talking about some international issues that I think are really relevant for who we are right now. And again, y'all know we often do news breakdown and all of that, but today is Malcolm X's birthday, so we're going to focus on him. And let me see if I can get this right. All right, Amina, let's go ahead, and I'm sharing the video clip. All right, let's go ahead and hit play.
African Americans, or so-called Negro. One of the reasons that it is bad for us to continue to just refer to ourselves as so-called Negro, that's negative. When we say so-called Negro, that's pointing out what we aren't, but it isn't telling us what we are. We are African, and we happen to be in America. We're not American. We are people who formerly were Africans who were kidnapped and brought to America. Our forefathers weren't the Pilgrims. We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. The rock was landed on us. We were brought here against our will. We were not brought here to be made citizens. We were not brought here to enjoy the constitutional gifts that they speak so beautifully about today. And because we weren't brought here to be made citizens today, now that we've become awakened to some degree and we begin to ask for those things which they say are supposedly for Americans, they look upon us with hostility and unfriendliness. So our unwanted presence, the fact that we are unwanted, is becoming magnified in all of America's preachments today. In the United Nations, you have poor...
Actually, Amina, keep it going, because I gave you the wrong time. He's going to right now shift to where he's talking about what's happening in the United Nations at this time. Let's listen to this part as well.
Poor nations and rich nations. They say that the most powerful bloc in the UN are the African Asian bloc. These are the poor nations. Yet they carry more weight in this political body than the nations do who have all the money. Why? Because no matter how wealthy America is, she only has one vote. No matter how wealthy Russia is, she only has one vote. Whereas all the poor nations in Africa who have just emerged into independence, they have each a vote too. And they stick together and are able to outmaneuver the rich nations. This is by having independence and the right to vote in the political world body, it has enabled the dark nations to band together and use the strength of their ballot to force the wealthy nations, which are the white nations, into giving more independence to other nations who are still under their jurisdiction. You and I have to look at this and understand this, that the ballot is as powerful as the bullet.
Let's pause right there.
Yeah.
Let's pause right there. Okay, so I think we're stopping the share. All right, we back. Okay. I think y'all were able to hear that, see that. Excellent. All right, so one of the most powerful things that he talks about there to me is not talking about Africa and when he's talking about these African nations, he's talking about nations that have just gotten their freedom, right? These are nations that are coming out of old colonialism. Now, they was about to run right into neo-colonialism, which we did not necessarily realize the implications thereof at the time. I say we like I was alive. I was not alive in the 60s. But historically speaking, they were coming out. These African nations are coming out of colonialization at the same time that Black Americans here are getting access to greater freedoms with the civil rights movement, at the same time that Caribbean Black nations are also throwing off the colonial powers in some different ways. Not quite what we saw happening in the continent of Africa, but we're seeing the stirrings, right? We're seeing conversations about what freedom and liberation looks like from a Pan-African perspective, right? From a broad diaspora space. And one of the things he talks about there was that neither of these African nations that were coming to this bloc, coming to the United Nations, neither of the Asian nations that were coming to the United Nations were world powers. These weren't nations that were superpowers in the definition, in the way that we think about them from the European context. These were powers that they each had a vote. They each had a vote. Now, Malcolm X is not here talking about the fact that we need all Black people to vote. That's not what he's saying. What he's saying, and he said specifically, we need to look at that because these Asian nations that were not superpowers and these African nations that were not superpowers, they each had a vote. They each had a participatory voice in the United Nations. And he says we need to look at that and we need to study that, not because we as Black Americans here have a superpower, but because when we come together and organize politically, collectively, and use not just our voting power, but also our voting power and our collective power in a variety of ways. Now, he's talking here about, this is a speech called The Ballot or the Bullet. And one of my key takeaways from the ballot or the bullet conversation is it's a whole lot easier to do this thing with the ballot than it is with the bullet. Half of us ain't ready for the bullet reality. We ain't ready for that conversation. I'm raising my hand. I don't want to deal with no bullets. I don't want to deal with no bullets. I'd rather do this with the ballot. It's easier. It's cleaner. People don't die. Now, he probably had a whole lot of other things to say about that because people actually can. That was a little too glib. I don't even think I should say people don't die because we live in a time of incredible political violence and our communities have gone through a lot of political violence. So I got to retract that statement. That was a little too glib. Sometimes I'd be a little too, quick at the lips and need to think a little bit more about how the words are going to land. So I'm going to retract that statement. But he was saying that it's a lot easier to do this thing with the ballot. And because not because the ballot was going to create Wakanda, not because voting as a bloc with these Asian and African countries was going to do away with the IMF or the World Monetary Fund or any of these other international enterprises and efforts that were essentially driving poverty in these other nations. But he was talking about the fact that they were able to block some of the most harmful things that the UN was going to do. They were able to block some of what the Western powers were trying to do vis-a-vis the UN because they organized. And one of the things I love about Hajj Malik Shabazz is that he is an organizer. Yes, he was a minister. Yes, he was preaching and teaching a good word, but he was also a part of organizing thought processes. He was part of organizing movements and efforts. And this is so important right now as we acknowledge, yes, the 100th anniversary of his birth and happy heavenly birthday, happy ancestor. But we also need to look at the models that he set out, because when he talked about organizing, it wasn't to organize to benefit a political party. It was organizing to benefit us. He wasn't talking about organizing to be a Republican or a Democrat or to help the independents. He was talking about what is in the best interest of our community and our people. And then he takes this international view, because for Malcolm X, there's no separation between him and the rest of the Pan-African world. We saw that with his travels towards the end of his life when he's traveling and he's coming into a space where he is coming out of his connection and affiliation with the Nation of Islam. We're not talking about that situation today. Y'all know what it is. It is what it is, and it is what it was. But he's coming out of the confines of that relationship, and we see him growing and evolving in such a way that for him, the right move was to to then go into exploring the connections that he as a Black American here with Afro-Caribbean roots, and thinking about what that meant for his connection to the rest of the African world. And I think if we take that as a model, as an example, especially in this day and age, because remember, when Malcolm X was having this conversation, when Hajj, Malik, Shabazz, they were having these conversations, they hadn't had 50, 60 years of civil rights yet. They had been from the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. That people have been struggling and fighting just to get to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, just to get to the 1965 Voting Rights Act and the 68 Fair Housing Act. So he wasn't talking about as somebody who was benefiting from decades of integration, such as it is, but he was talking about it as somebody who realized our potential power. So he looks at this international example where these African countries and these Asian countries are able to come together in the UN, in addition to all of the other type of organizing that they had to do, in addition to all the other organizing work that was necessary. They're able to come together and prevent harm as vis-a-vis the tool of the United Nations, and to expand benefits vis-a-vis the United Nations. Amina, I want to go back to this clip, because after he talks about this in the international context, then he comes back to talk about it in the global, he's talking about it, yes, in the international context. Then he comes back to talk about it in the context of what it looks like here in these United States. All right, I'm going to share my screen again. I think this is going to work. Hold on, because Amina, I want to go back to that clip. Lord Jesus, did I do this right? I might not have. Let's pray it works. Okay, go ahead and hit play.
Now, if you and I leave it up to the moderate Negro leaders, they'll be able to trick it up and make the world think that they passed something that doesn't really mean anything. So what you and I have got to do is get involved. You and I have to be right there breathing down their throat. Every time they look over their shoulder, we want them to see us. We want to make them pass the strongest civil rights bill they've ever passed. Because we know even after they pass it, they can't enforce it. In order to do this, we're starting a voters registration drive.
Ooh.
We have to get everybody in Harlem registered. Not as Democrats or Republicans, but registered as independents. We're going to organize a corps of brothers and sisters who, after the city is mapped out, they won't leave one apartment house door not knocked on. There won't be a door in Harlem that will not have been knocked on, to see that whatever black face lives behind that door is registered to vote.
That's right.
By a certain time this year. Nobody will have an excuse not to be registered. We'll ask him, let us see your card. If you don't have the sense of responsibility to get registered, we'll move you out of town. It's going to be the ballot or the bullet. After we get our people registered, we can then organize that voting strength and channel it in the direction that will get immediate results for the benefit of our people. We can sweep our enemies right out of office, but we will not be able to do it sitting around talking about select and elect your own candidates.
Let's pause it there. Let's pause it there, because then he's going to go into some of the minutia of what was happening in that day and age. Y'all, he's not talking about let's vote to make America great. He is not talking about let's register people to vote in the tradition of we want to thrive and we want to be a part of America. No, he's not talking about let's vote and let's organize our communities to vote because there's some Americana apple pie that he thinks we should have access to. No, that's not what he's voting for. Similar to the ways in which when our ancestors were first fighting for the right to vote vis-a-vis the 15th Amendment, when they were fighting for that thing, they weren't fighting for it because they wanted apple pie and fireworks at the 4th of July. They were fighting for the right to vote because if the sheriff is an elected position And the sheriff also happens to be in charge of the Ku Klux Klan. And then we have the right to vote. We can prevent that Ku Klux Klan member from becoming the sheriff, which means his ability to terrorize us is going to be a little bit less great. Now, he is still going to be a terrible, evil, awful terrorist, a racist, somebody who should be meeting. Let me remember, I don't own these airwaves. But he wasn't talking. They weren't talking about getting the right to vote because they wanted to be a part of Americana. They were talking about it because there is a direct connection between who is put into office and the ability for us to determine outcomes in our lives. There is a direct connection between who is in office in the state of Georgia right now and the fact that Adriana, that 30-year-old sister who we mentioned first on Friday, who we're going to talk in depth about today, that's that 30-year-old sister who is brain dead, functionally not physically here except for the machines that are keeping her body alive almost in a zombie-like effort. Adriana Smith is her name. And they're doing it just to see if they can gestate and continue to grow this fetus that was 9 weeks at the time that she was brain dead. That sort of experimentation on our bodies has a direct connection to the outcomes at the ballot box. When it comes to the bans on our ability to get access to education, when we see not just the tens of thousands of federal employees who've been let go, but the fact that they are purging black people from these spaces. They are purging black leadership from the military, from our federal government, and it's trickling down into the private sector. That has a direct correlation to the ballot. Now, Malcolm X wasn't saying, let's vote because we're Americans. He's not saying that at all. In fact, he goes on to say, we are not Americans. We are stolen Africans. We were stolen from Africa. We were brought here, and now we're doing the best we can with what we got. But he talks strategy here. He says, we're going to go every single door in Harlem. Ain't going to be a single door in Harlem that ain't knocked on so we can get out the vote and make sure people are registered. And hear what he says. He doesn't say we're not to register them as a Democrat. Not to register them as a Republican, to register them so that they will have the ability to help pick who is in charge of this country, who is in charge of their community. When our ancestors were fighting for the right to vote, it wasn't because they wanted apple Americana pie and to sing the Star Spangled Banner, which we should stop singing and stop standing for. It was a song that celebrated our enslavement. They were fighting for the right to vote because when the tax assessor comes by and says your home has no value, so that when they use eminent domain to take your property, they ain't got to pay you nothing. The tax assessor is an elected position. When the commissioner or the chancellor of your education system comes by and wants to put racists in charge of your education, if that's an elected position, or if the chancellor is appointed by your mayor, like in New York City, where the mayor is elected and it gets to appoint the chancellor, and that's an elected position, we have to have a say in who's going to have power. This is not about Americana. Malcolm X, Hajj, Malik, Shabazz was not talking about being better Americans. He was talking about using the tools that we have available to us to prevent harm and to create an opportunity for us to have a slightly better environment than the one we currently have so that we can do the work. When he was talking about Asian countries and African countries modeling this at the UN, he wasn't suggesting that by being a part of the voting apparatus at the UN, these Asian countries and African countries were going to win the day, but they were going to be able to prevent harm. And we are in primary season right now. And I want us to think about the harm that could have been prevented had we been a little more engaged at the ballot box. And I'm saying a little more engaged because, yes, there were voter suppression, but a lot of people stayed home. Of the people who came out to vote, yes, the 92%, yes, the 80%, we did what we have to do. But there were so many people who came home because they were looking for a candidate that was titillating. They were looking for a candidate who they liked. They were looking for a candidate who made them feel warm and fuzzy inside and feel all the feelings of the goodness. That's not what we go to the voting booth for. You need a lover. Like you need some toys in your room. If you're looking for that sort of titillation, that's what you go there for. If you want somebody who's going to be a moral guide and a leader in the nation, go to your pastor. And hopefully your pastor is fulfilling that role because I know not all of them do. But if you're looking for moral leadership in this nation, that is not what politics is. That is what your pastor is, or your faith leader is, or your monk, or your rabbi, or your imam. That's what they do. That's what the moral people in your community do. Politicians, and this is something that Hajj Malik Shabazz understood very, very well. Politicians are simply the people that we hire to make resource allocation decisions. That's it. You don't have to like them. You don't have to love them. You might not can't stand they stanky ass draws. But are they going to get to decide who gets clean water and who doesn't? Yes. Which means them with their stinky ass draws and all need to either be voted out or voted into office. When we are going to the ballot box, and we are in primary season right now, a lot of you're not at the federal level with elections, but there is an election in your community every year, I promise you. And we are in primary season right now, getting ready to go into the November election. And this is not about saving America, because this place is breaking. They are breaking it, and I'm willing to let them. I'm perfectly content to let them see them do it. But we have to think about what comes in the hereafter. And in the hereafter, I want to think like El Hajj Malik El Shabazz. In the hereafter, I want to think about what are going to be the conditions on the ground that we're going to need to rebuild, because baby, we are going to have to rebuild. They are breaking and destroying this entire thing, and let them do it. You let them do it. Like that plantation, let it burn. Although I will say there have been some black historians who have talked about the burning plantation who have been concerned, because while we are gleefully, joyfully, Juneteenthly celebrating the destruction of that plantation and the fact that the service house behind it did not burn. Ooh, somebody said the ancestors had very good aim. While we're celebrating that, we should also be clear that in those houses, in those plantations, there's also evidence. There's also historical records. There's also information that we actually need. So I'm celebrating the burning the same way I was joyful on the day of the Alabama Slammer when we saw that riverboat hat to the sky. Like, I'm celebrating with a tinge of caution, but I'm celebrating. But there are some things we need to think about there as well. But we just need to be clear that as we think about El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, as we think about who he was, who he is to us today, we've got Ibram X. Kendi, Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, who's got a new book out for young people, introducing them to Malcolm X via his young life. And you guys can hear that conversation. We had him on a couple of weeks ago, but you'll be able to hear that conversation in today's episode of the podcast. Lurie breaks it down. But we just have to think differently about how we celebrate our ancestors. I think we have to be more excited to celebrate them, talk about them, think about their stories, think about their critiques, think about what they had to say then, apply it to today, think about what they might have evolved into, how their thoughts might have changed and shifted a bit as they grew older had they not been assassinated. These are ways that we honor our ancestors. And what was our moment of gratitude today? Hold on, let me pull it back up. Ihime Ora for today's moment of gratitude had something to say. This was the inspiration we used for our moment of gratitude ritual today. She said, your ancestors are too mighty for you to be sitting there intimidated by anything or anyone. You better buck up. And when you got somebody like El Hajj Malik El Shabazz as your ancestor who is telling you this is the way we gonna do it, this is how we gonna do it, and if you don't want to get registered, you can't stay here no more. If not, and I don't care, he wasn't even saying who to vote for, but he was saying if you're not gonna get registered and do the bare minimum of making sure our community has what it needs, you got to get run up out the community. Now, I don't have no organizing capacity to do all that. I'm not running nobody out the community. I'm not El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, but I do know that we are given opportunities, and we can take some opportunities to think about how we better show up for our community and ourselves. And I think that his words today was just something I wanted to settle in a bit and think about, because I feel like we need to draw on his messaging. We need to draw on the lessons that we possibly can as best as we can. We're going to leave it there today. So I'm going to come off of Zoom. I'm going to stop sharing with Zoom. YouTube, appreciate you guys. I love you. And we'll be back tomorrow. I think I'll be in the studio